The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo Vecchio as Lorenzo walked through the corridors that had once echoed with the footsteps of the Medici. His leather boots clicked against the stone with the measured rhythm of a man who had learned to control every aspect of his existence. 3 years ago, he had been a different person, entirely undisciplined, reactive, at the mercy of every emotion and impulse that swept through him. Today, he was something else, a living testament to Machiavelli's most profound insight about human transformation. The change had not been comfortable for those around him. Lorenzo paused before the great window overlooking the Arno River, remembering the man he used to be. That version of himself had been popular at court gatherings, always ready with a joke or an impulsive gesture, quick to anger and quicker to forgive. People had found him predictable in his unpredictability, safe in his chaos. They could manipulate his emotions, count on his reactions, and use his weaknesses as stepping stones for their own advancement. But weakness, Lorenzo had learned through bitter experience, was not just a personal failing, it was a vulnerability that others exploited without conscience. The night his former partner had abandoned their shared business venture, taking with her not only the accumulated profits but also his trust and his sense of identity, Lorenzo had faced a choice that would define the rest of his existence. He could remain the weak, reactive person who had allowed such betrayal to occur, or he could begin the painful process of destroying that version of himself entirely. The transformation had begun with the smallest disciplines. Each morning, Lorenzo rose at dawn regardless of how he felt. He exercised his body with the same methodical precision that a craftsman applies to his trade. He studied philosophy, history, and human nature with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Most importantly, he learned to observe his own mind with the detached curiosity of a natural scientist examining a specimen. Within 6 months, the changes became visible to others. Lorenzo no longer reacted immediately to provocation. He paused, considered, and responded from a place of calculated intention rather than emotional impulse. He stopped seeking approval from those around him and began making decisions based on his own carefully constructed principles. He learned to say no without explanation, to pursue his goals without apology, and to maintain his course regardless of how others felt about his choices. The discomfort among his social circle was immediate and profound. Maria, who had once been able to manipulate Lorenzo's sympathies to secure favorable business arrangements, found herself facing a man who listened politely to her requests and, then, made decisions based purely on merit and mutual benefit. "You've become cold," she complained after he declined to invest in her latest venture, a decision that proved wise when the project collapsed 6 months later. His brother Antonio, accustomed to Lorenzo's financial generosity during times of self-created crisis, discovered that the unlimited emotional and monetary support he had taken for granted was no longer available. "You're not the same person," Antonio said with genuine confusion. "It's like you don't care about family anymore." But Lorenzo understood something that his critics did not: he cared more deeply than ever before. The difference was that his care was now disciplined, intentional, and effective rather than reactive, manipulable, and ultimately destructive. He had not become heartless, he had become strategic in how he deployed his heart. The process of destroying his weak self had required Lorenzo to confront truths about human nature that most people prefer to ignore. He studied Machiavelli not as a guide to manipulation, but as an honest observer of how power, influence, and human relationships actually function beneath the veneer of polite society. The Prince was not a manual for cruelty, it was a clear-eyed examination of why good intentions without practical wisdom so often lead to disaster. Lorenzo's discipline became a mirror that reflected the undisciplined nature of those around him. When he stopped participating in gossip, others became uncomfortable with their own tendency towards small-minded conversation. When he maintained his exercise routine regardless of weather or social obligations, it highlighted their own inconsistency. When he chose long-term strategic thinking over short-term emotional satisfaction, it exposed their own impulsiveness. The most challenging aspect of his transformation was learning to remain unmoved by the emotional reactions his discipline provoked in others. Former friends accused him of arrogance, family members claimed he had become uncaring, and romantic interests found him too intense or emotionally unavailable. Each criticism was designed, consciously or unconsciously, to pull him back toward the weakness they could understand and exploit. Lorenzo recognized these attempts for what they were: the desperate clawing of crabs trying to pull an escaping companion back into the bucket. The weak self that others had known and manipulated was gone, and, with it, their ability to predict, influence, and, ultimately control his behavior. Their discomfort was not about his character, it was about their loss of power over him. As months turned into years, Lorenzo's disciplined approach to life began to yield results that even his critics could not ignore. His business ventures succeeded because they were based on careful analysis rather than emotional impulse. His relationships became deeper and more authentic because they were built on mutual respect rather than codependence. His health improved, his thinking became clearer, and his sense of purpose strengthened with each passing day. Yet the social cost remained significant. Old friendships dissolved as people found they could no longer relate to someone who had eliminated the familiar patterns of weakness they had come to expect. Family gatherings became tense as relatives struggled to adjust to a Lorenzo who could not be guilt, manipulated, or swayed from his chosen course through emotional appeals. But Lorenzo also began to attract a different type of person into his orbit. Individuals who appreciated discipline, who valued personal growth, and who understood that true strength comes not from the absence of challenge but from the consistent choice to rise above one's baser impulses. These new relationships were built on a foundation of mutual respect for the work each person was doing to become their best self. The loneliness of transformation was real and, sometimes, overwhelming. There were nights when Lorenzo questioned whether the price of discipline was worth paying, when the warmth of his old, chaotic life seemed preferable to the sometimes stark clarity of his new existence. During these moments, he would return to Machiavelli's writings and find renewed strength in the understanding that great men throughout history had walked the same difficult path. The philosopher had written that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, and that everyone sees what you appear to be, but few experience what you really are. Lorenzo came to understand that most people's discomfort with his discipline stemmed not from malice but from their inability to comprehend a life lived according to internal principles rather than external validation. As he stood in the palazzo that morning, watching the sun climb higher above the ancient city, Lorenzo reflected on the paradox that had become central to his existence. By destroying his weak self, the part that sought approval, that reacted emotionally, that could be easily influenced and manipulated, he had become virtually indestructible to outside forces. No one could devastate him because he no longer depended on their opinions for his sense of worth. No one could derail his plans because those plans were no longer subject to the whims of momentary emotion. This was not the cold detachment that his critics accused him of developing. It was something far more sophisticated, the warm strength of a person who has learned to love himself enough to demand the best from himself, and who extends that same demanding love to others by refusing to enable their weaknesses. The weak Lorenzo could be destroyed by a harsh word, a rejected proposal, or an unexpected setback. The disciplined Lorenzo faced these same challenges with the calm assessment of a ship's captain navigating rough seas, alert to the danger, responsive to changing conditions, but never in doubt about his destination or his ability to reach it. His transformation had taught him that Machiavelli's insights extended far beyond the realm of political strategy. The prince who wished to maintain power had to eliminate the weaknesses that his enemies could exploit. Similarly, any person who wished to live with purpose and effectiveness had to identify and systematically destroy the aspects of their character that made them vulnerable to manipulation, distraction, and defeat. This process was not about becoming perfect or eliminating all human emotion. It was about becoming conscious, about moving from reactive patterns established in childhood and youth toward intentional choices made by a mature mind that understood both the stakes and the consequences of every decision. Lorenzo's discipline made others uncomfortable because it reminded them of their own potential, their own unused strength, their own capacity for transformation. Most people preferred to believe that they were fixed entities, that their personalities and limitations were unchangeable facts of nature rather than choices they made every day. Confronting someone who had actually done the work of changing challenged this comfortable illusion. The businessman who complained that Lorenzo had become too serious was really expressing discomfort with his own lack of purpose. The family member who accused him of being uncaring was projecting their own inability to set healthy boundaries. The former romantic partner who claimed he was emotionally unavailable was revealing their preference for drama over genuine intimacy. But Lorenzo had learned not to take responsibility for others' emotional reactions to his growth. This had been perhaps the most difficult lesson of all, understanding that his obligation was to become the best version of himself, not to remain stunted for the comfort of others. As the morning progressed and the palazzo filled with the sounds of daily activity, Lorenzo prepared for a meeting that would test every principle he had developed over the past 3 years. A former business partner, the same one whose betrayal had catalyzed his transformation, had requested a meeting to propose a new venture. The old Lorenzo would have either refused out of wounded pride or agreed out of forgiveness and hope. The new Lorenzo would evaluate the proposal on its merits while maintaining complete awareness of the history and the risks involved. The ability to separate past hurt from present opportunity, to assess character accurately while leaving room for genuine change, to protect himself without becoming cynical, these were the fruits of disciplined self-development. They represented not the absence of humanity but its full flowering under conscious direction. Walking toward the meeting room, Lorenzo carried with him the quiet confidence of a man who had faced his own weaknesses and emerged victorious. Not because he had eliminated all vulnerability that was impossible and undesirable, but because he had eliminated the unconscious vulnerabilities that others could exploit without his permission. The man who destroys his weak self becomes truly indestructible because destruction can only come through the cooperation of weakness. External forces may create challenges, setbacks, even genuine hardships, but they cannot penetrate the armor of a consciousness that has learned to respond rather than react, to choose rather than be chosen for, to love from strength rather than need. His former partner entered the room with the confident smile of someone who expected to find the same malleable, emotional man she had manipulated years before. Lorenzo greeted her with polite professionalism, noting the slight confusion that flickered across her face when she encountered someone completely different from her memory. The meeting would proceed according to business principles, evaluated through the lens of practical wisdom rather than personal history. This was discipline in action, not rigid inflexibility, but the fluid strength of someone who had learned to bend without breaking, to engage without losing himself, to care deeply while maintaining clarity. The discomfort his transformation caused others was simply the price of refusing to participate in the unconscious games that most people mistake for authentic relationship. As they began to discuss the proposed venture, Lorenzo embodied the truth that Machiavelli had understood centuries ago: real power comes not from the ability to control others, but from the refusal to be controlled. Real strength emerges not from avoiding challenge, but from meeting it with the full resources of a consciousness that has been tempered by discipline and informed by wisdom. The weak self that others had known and found comfortable was indeed gone forever, replaced by something far more valuable, a human being who had learned to live intentionally, to love wisely, and to contribute meaningfully to the world without sacrificing his essential integrity. If that made others uncomfortable, Lorenzo had learned to accept that discomfort as confirmation that he was moving in the right direction. The architecture of self-destruction, the systematic destruction of one's weak self, requires more than good intentions or philosophical understanding. It demands the construction of what Lorenzo had come to think of as an architecture of transformation, a carefully designed framework of practices, principles, and perspectives that gradually replace the ineffective patterns of the undisciplined mind. 3 months after that pivotal meeting, Lorenzo found himself walking through the gardens of his estate, observing how the disciplined arrangement of paths, plantings, and structures created beauty through order rather than chaos. The parallel to human development was unmistakable. Just as a garden requires constant, intelligent intervention to reach its potential, the human character demands ongoing cultivation to transcend its natural tendencies toward entropy and weakness. The first pillar of this architecture was radical self-observation. Lorenzo had learned to watch his own mind with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar culture. Every emotional reaction, every impulse to avoid difficulty, every moment of seeking external validation became data to be examined rather than experiences to be blindly followed. This level of self-awareness initially proved more disturbing than liberating. Lorenzo discovered that much of what he had considered his authentic personality was actually a collection of unconscious responses designed to avoid discomfort, gain approval, or maintain the illusion of safety. His humor often masked insecurity, his generosity frequently stemmed from a desperate need to be liked, and his anger typically arose from his own failure to maintain appropriate boundaries. The process of recognizing these patterns without immediately trying to change them had been counterintuitive. His natural impulse was to judge these discoveries harshly and attempt to force immediate transformation. But Lorenzo learned through experience that sustainable change required first developing the capacity to observe without reaction, to see his weaknesses clearly without being overwhelmed by shame or self-criticism. Dr. Elena Rossini, a psychologist who had become both mentor and friend during Lorenzo's transformation, had explained this principle during one of their early conversations. "The mind that judges cannot heal," she had said. "You must first learn to see yourself with the same compassionate clarity you would bring to studying a child who is struggling to learn a difficult skill." This perspective had revolutionized Lorenzo's approach to personal development. Instead of treating his weaknesses as moral failures, he began to view them as outdated survival strategies that had served their purpose during earlier phases of his life but now hindered his growth. The weak self was not evil, it was simply obsolete. The second pillar was the cultivation of discomfort tolerance. Lorenzo had discovered that most of his destructive patterns stemmed from an unconscious drive to avoid any form of emotional, physical, or psychological discomfort. His weak self had been, at its core, a sophisticated avoidance mechanism. Building tolerance for discomfort required starting with small, manageable challenges and gradually expanding his capacity. He began taking cold showers, sitting in meditation while experiencing difficult emotions, having conversations he would rather avoid, and pursuing goals that required sustained effort without immediate reward. Each successful navigation of discomfort strengthened his confidence in his ability to handle whatever life might present. More importantly, it freed him from the unconscious fear that had previously governed so many of his decisions. When someone is no longer afraid of being uncomfortable, they become essentially unmanipulable through emotional pressure. This principle extended to his professional life with remarkable results. Lorenzo had once avoided difficult conversations with employees, allowing performance issues to fester rather than addressing them directly. His transformed approach meant addressing problems immediately and clearly, despite the temporary awkwardness such conversations might create. The results were dramatic. His business relationships became more honest and productive, his employees developed greater respect for his leadership, and the overall culture of his organization shifted toward accountability and excellence. What had initially seemed harsh to those accustomed to his previous avoidance patterns proved to be a more compassionate approach in the long term. The third pillar involved the development of what Lorenzo called strategic vulnerability. This was perhaps the most subtle aspect of his transformation and the one that most confused outside observers. Rather than becoming invulnerable through emotional numbness, he had learned to be vulnerable in chosen ways at chosen times with chosen people. The weak self had been vulnerable in all directions at all times, influenced by every opinion, affected by every criticism, dependent on constant external validation. The transformed Lorenzo chose when and how to be open, maintaining clear boundaries while still allowing for genuine connection and growth. This strategic approach to vulnerability required developing sophisticated judgment about people and situations. Lorenzo had to learn to distinguish between individuals who were trustworthy and those who were not, between feedback that was genuinely helpful and criticism that was designed to manipulate or control. His relationship with his sister Claudia illustrated this principle in action. Claudia had a long history of using emotional manipulation to get her way, alternating between excessive praise and harsh criticism depending on whether Lorenzo was complying with her wishes. The old Lorenzo had been completely reactive to these tactics, either swelling with pride at her approval or collapsing into guilt at her disapproval. The transformed Lorenzo could receive both praise and criticism from Claudia without being emotionally destabilized by either. He evaluated her feedback based on its merit rather than its emotional tone, maintained affection for her as a person while refusing to be controlled by her tactics, and offered support when she genuinely needed it while declining to enable her manipulative patterns. This shift in their dynamic had been profoundly uncomfortable for Claudia, who lost her most reliable source of control over her brother. Her initial response was to escalate her tactics, alternating between accusations of coldness and attempts to provoke guilt through references to family loyalty and shared history. But Lorenzo held firm to his new boundaries, and gradually their relationship evolved into something more authentic and respectful. Claudia learned that manipulation would not work, but genuine communication would be warmly received. The relationship became less dramatic but far more satisfying for both parties. The fourth pillar was the development of independent value systems. Lorenzo had realized that much of his previous suffering stemmed from accepting other people's definitions of success, happiness, and worth. His weak self had been constantly comparing his life to others, seeking approval from people whose values he didn't actually share, and pursuing goals that had been imposed by society rather than chosen through careful self-reflection. Creating his own value system required extensive study and contemplation. Lorenzo read philosophy, psychology, and biography, not to find answers but to encounter different ways of thinking about fundamental questions. He examined the lives of people he genuinely admired, identifying the principles and practices that had enabled their achievements and fulfillment. Most importantly, he conducted careful experiments in his own life, testing different approaches to work, relationships, and personal development to discover what actually contributed to his sense of purpose and satisfaction. This process revealed that many of the things he had been taught to value, social status, material accumulation, constant entertainment, were actually obstacles to genuine fulfillment. His new value system prioritized growth over comfort, authenticity over approval, and contribution over consumption. These were not abstract ideals but practical principles that guided his daily decisions and long-term planning. The fifth pillar involved developing what Lorenzo termed emotional sovereignty, the ability to experience the full range of human emotions without being controlled by them. This was distinct from emotional suppression, which his critics often accused him of practicing. Emotional sovereignty meant feeling anger without immediately acting on it, experiencing sadness without being paralyzed by it, and enjoying happiness without becoming dependent on it. Lorenzo learned to view emotions as information rather than commands, valuable data about his internal state and external circumstances rather than irresistible forces that determined his behavior. This skill proved invaluable in all areas of life. In business negotiations, he could remain calm and strategic even when facing aggressive tactics or unreasonable demands. In personal relationships, he could address conflicts without being overwhelmed by his own emotional reactions or manipulated by others' emotional displays. The development of emotional sovereignty required consistent practice and often felt artificial at first. Lorenzo sometimes worried that he was becoming cold or losing his humanity. But, over time, he discovered that conscious emotional regulation actually enhanced his capacity for genuine feeling rather than diminishing it. When he chose to express anger, it carried the weight of a considered response rather than the chaos of an unconscious reaction. When he experienced joy, it was deeper and more sustainable because it wasn't dependent on external circumstances. When he felt love, it was more reliable and trustworthy because it came from choice rather than need. The sixth and final pillar was the cultivation of what Machiavelli would have recognized as virtue, the combination of skill, courage, and wisdom that enables effective action in an imperfect world. This went beyond mere competence to encompass the ability to make difficult decisions, take calculated risks, and maintain integrity under pressure. Virtue required Lorenzo to develop expertise not just in his chosen profession but in the fundamental skills of human existence, communication, judgment, leadership, and the ability to navigate complex social and political dynamics without compromising his essential values. This meant studying power, how it works, how it's gained and lost, how it can be used constructively or destructively. Lorenzo learned to recognize power dynamics in every interaction, not to manipulate them but to navigate them effectively while maintaining his integrity. He studied the biographies of leaders who had faced genuine moral challenges and emerged with their principles intact. He analyzed their decision-making processes, their methods of building alliances, and their strategies for implementing difficult but necessary changes. Most importantly, he practiced these skills in increasingly challenging situations, gradually building his capacity to operate effectively in complex, high-stakes environments without losing sight of his values or compromising his character. The integration of these 6 pillars created a foundation that could withstand virtually any external pressure. Lorenzo's transformation from weak to disciplined was not about becoming perfect or eliminating all vulnerability. It was about becoming consciously competent, fully aware of his capabilities and limitations, clear about his values and priorities, and skilled in the practical arts of effective living. This architecture of self-destruction and reconstruction had taken years to build and would require lifetime maintenance. But the result was a quality of life that his former self could never have imagined: deep satisfaction from meaningful work, authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than mutual need, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing one can handle whatever challenges life might present. The discomfort his transformation caused others was simply the inevitable result of refusing to participate in the unconscious agreements that govern most human interactions, the tacit understanding that everyone will remain small to avoid threatening anyone else's self-image, that personal growth will be superficial to maintain familiar relationship dynamics, and that comfort will be prioritized over truth. Lorenzo's disciplined existence challenged all of these assumptions simply by demonstrating that another way of living was possible. His success was not a judgment on others' choices, but his very existence suggested that their limitations were more optional than they preferred to believe. As he completed his evening walk through the gardens, Lorenzo reflected on the paradox that had become central to his understanding of human nature. The qualities that made someone easy to be around in the short term, agreeableness, predictability, emotional reactivity, often made them ineffective and, ultimately destructive in the long term. Conversely, the qualities that initially made someone challenging, clear boundaries, independent thinking, emotional regulation, typically made them more valuable and trustworthy as relationships deepened. The man who destroys his weak self becomes indestructible not because he becomes invulnerable to pain or challenge, but because he becomes capable of transforming any experience into wisdom, any setback into strength, and any conflict into an opportunity for deeper understanding. This was the true meaning of Machiavellian discipline, not the manipulation of others for selfish gain, but the mastery of oneself for the benefit of all. The prince who could not govern himself could never effectively govern others. The person who remained enslaved to his own weaknesses could never be genuinely helpful to anyone else. Lorenzo's journey was far from complete. He understood that the work of conscious self-development was a lifetime commitment rather than a destination to be reached. But he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The weak self that others had known was gone forever, replaced by something more reliable, more capable, and ultimately more loving than what had come before. The loneliness of strength. 5 years into his transformation, Lorenzo faced the most challenging test of his disciplined existence, the profound isolation that comes from outgrowing the social context in which one's identity was originally formed. Standing in his study late one December evening, surrounded by books that had guided his evolution and artifacts from a life increasingly foreign to those who had known him longest, he confronted the price that conscious self-development extracts from every serious practitioner. The loneliness was not the simple sadness of missing old friends or the temporary discomfort of social transition. It was something more fundamental, the recognition that true personal transformation inevitably leads to a form of exile from the unconscious agreements that bind most human communities together. His childhood friend Marco's visit earlier that week had crystallized this reality with startling clarity. They had grown up together, shared countless adventures, and maintained their friendship through 2 decades of life's changes. But, as they sat in Lorenzo's living room, attempting to recapture the easy connection of their youth, both men gradually realized they no longer inhabited the same psychological universe. Marco spoke with familiar patterns, complaining about his work while taking no action to change it, lamenting his relationship problems while repeating the same ineffective strategies, expressing frustration with his health while maintaining destructive habits. These conversations had once felt natural to Lorenzo because they mirrored his own internal patterns. Now they felt like watching someone voluntarily remain trapped in a cage whose door stood wide open. Lorenzo listened with genuine compassion, offering practical suggestions when asked and emotional support throughout. But he could no longer pretend to share Marco's fundamental assumption that their problems were external impositions rather than internal choices. The gap between their perspectives had grown too wide to bridge through nostalgia or goodwill alone. "You've changed," Marco said as he prepared to leave, and the words carried the weight of loss rather than celebration. "I don't know how to relate to who you've become." This scene had repeated itself with variations across every significant relationship from Lorenzo's former life. His family struggled with his unwillingness to participate in familiar dynamics of drama and dysfunction. Colleagues found his clarity and directness unsettling after years of comfortable ambiguity. Even his romantic relationships faced the challenge of his evolution beyond the patterns that had initially attracted his partners. The transformation that had brought Lorenzo such personal fulfillment had also created a form of social exile. Not because he had become arrogant or withdrawn, but because he had developed beyond the psychological needs and fears that govern most human interactions. Dr. Rossini had warned him about this phase during their early work together. The hardest part, she had explained, is not developing discipline, it's learning to live with the space that discipline creates between you and others. Most people prefer shared suffering to individual transcendence. Lorenzo had initially dismissed this as an exaggeration, believing that his growth would inspire others rather than isolate him. He had underestimated how threatening competence can be to those who have made peace with incompetence, how destabilizing clarity becomes to those who have adapted to confusion, and how uncomfortable strength appears to those who have identified with weakness. The issue was not that Lorenzo had become judgmental or superior. His discipline had actually enhanced his capacity for compassion and understanding. He could see clearly why people made destructive choices without condemning them for those choices. He could recognize the fear, pain, and conditioning that drove most human behavior without feeling superior to those who remain trapped by these forces. But this very clarity created distance. When someone complains about a problem they could easily solve, genuine empathy requires acknowledging both their suffering and their agency. Most people prefer sympathy that validates their victimhood rather than compassion that recognizes their power. Lorenzo's sister Claudia had accused him of becoming preachy when he gently suggested that her recurring financial crises might be related to her spending patterns rather than external circumstances. His brother Antonio claimed he had become cold when Lorenzo declined to enable his self-destructive relationship patterns through emotional and financial support. Neither accusation was entirely fair, but both contained kernels of truth. Lorenzo had indeed become less willing to participate in the mutual deception that often passes for emotional support. He would no longer pretend that self-created problems were external impositions, that destructive patterns were temporary setbacks, or that growth was impossible for anyone willing to do the work. This shift had profound implications for his romantic life. The women attracted to his earlier version had been drawn to his chaos, his neediness, and his potential for improvement that would never be realized. They enjoyed the drama of trying to fix him while maintaining their own familiar dysfunctions. His transformation had eliminated the psychological hooks that had made him attractive to partners who preferred projects to equals. The relationships that ended during his transformation taught Lorenzo uncomfortable truths about human attraction and compatibility. Many people are unconsciously drawn to partners whose weaknesses complement their own, creating relationships based on mutual dysfunction rather than mutual growth. When one person begins to outgrow these patterns, the relationship often becomes impossible to maintain. His relationship with Isabella illustrated this dynamic perfectly. They had been together for 3 years, and she had constantly complained about his lack of direction, his emotional reactivity, and his inconsistency. But, when he actually addressed these issues, she found herself attracted to the stability and clarity she had claimed to want. "I miss the old you," she admitted during their final conversation. "You were more fun when you were a mess." This confession revealed the hidden psychology that governs many relationships, the comfort people find in partners whose problems make them feel better about their own limitations. Lorenzo's growth had eliminated her ability to feel superior to his chaos, forcing her to confront her own underdeveloped areas without the distraction of managing his dysfunction. The professional realm presented similar challenges. Lorenzo's increased competence, clarity, and reliability made him more valuable as a business partner and leader, but it also created tension with colleagues who had grown comfortable with lower standards. His willingness to address problems directly, make difficult decisions quickly, and maintain high expectations gradually isolated him from the consensus building and conflict avoidance that characterize most organizational cultures. During a particularly challenging period when his company faced a major strategic decision, Lorenzo found himself alone and advocating for the difficult but necessary choice while his partners preferred a compromise that would avoid short-term discomfort while creating long-term problems. His isolated position was not based on superior intelligence or moral clarity, but on his willingness to face unpleasant realities that others preferred to avoid. The decision ultimately proved correct, and the company benefited significantly from his guidance. But the process revealed how discipline and clear thinking can create isolation even when they lead to better outcomes for everyone involved. This isolation was compounded by the difficulty of forming new relationships with people who operated from similar levels of personal development. The pool of potential friends, romantic partners, and business associates who shared his commitment to growth and honest self-reflection was significantly smaller than the general population. Moreover, these individuals were often as focused on their own development as he was on his, creating practical challenges for building the deep connections that make life meaningful. Lorenzo discovered that strength, like weakness, could become self-reinforcing. The more capable he became, the more others expected of him and the less they were willing to offer in return. Friends who had once shared resources and support now viewed him as someone who should be able to handle everything alone. Family members who had previously treated him as an equal now approached him primarily when they needed help with problems they felt incapable of solving themselves. The burden of competence was real and sometimes overwhelming. When everyone around you assumes you have unlimited capacity to handle difficulties, it becomes increasingly difficult to find support when you face genuine challenges. The strong person is often expected to be invulnerable, self-sufficient, and endlessly available to help others without requiring help in return. But Lorenzo also discovered unexpected sources of connection and community. His transformation had attracted a different type of person into his orbit, individuals who appreciated depth over superficiality, growth over comfort, and authenticity over agreeableness. These relationships were fewer in number but richer in quality than what he had known before. His friendship with Dr. Rossini had evolved from a professional relationship into a genuine mentorship and friendship. She introduced him to a small community of individuals who shared similar commitments to personal development and conscious living. These connections were built on mutual respect for the work each person was doing rather than shared complaints about life's difficulties. His relationship with Elena, whom he met at a philosophy lecture, represented a new model of romantic partnership. Both had done significant personal work before meeting, and their relationship was built on mutual growth rather than mutual need. They challenged each other to become better versions of themselves while providing genuine support during difficult periods. These new relationships were not without their own challenges. When two strong, independent people attempt to build a life together, traditional relationship models often prove inadequate. Lorenzo and Elena had to create their own patterns of interaction, communication, and mutual support without the familiar templates that govern most romantic partnerships. But the quality of connection possible when two people meet from positions of strength rather than weakness proved worth every difficulty. Their conflicts were about genuine differences of opinion rather than projections of internal wounds. Their support for each other was based on choice rather than need. Their love was grounded in appreciation for who each person actually was rather than fantasy about who they might become. The loneliness of strength was real, but it was qualitatively different from the loneliness of weakness. The weak self had been surrounded by people but genuinely known by none, accepted for his potential rather than his reality, needed for his dysfunction rather than his capabilities. The strong self was known by fewer people but understood more deeply, valued for his actual contributions rather than his entertaining problems, and respected for his character rather than pitted for his struggles. Lorenzo learned to distinguish between isolation and solitude. Isolation was the painful experience of being surrounded by people with whom genuine connection was impossible. Solitude was the peaceful experience of being alone with a self worth knowing, engaged in activities that brought satisfaction independent of external validation. His evening walks through Florence became a form of meditation, an opportunity to process the day's experiences and connect with the deeper currents of his own development. The city itself seemed to support this reflection, its ancient stones holding the stories of countless individuals who had wrestled with similar questions about power, character, and the price of wisdom. These solitary periods were not lonely but restorative. Lorenzo had learned to enjoy his own company in a way that his weak self never could. The constant need for external stimulation, validation, and distraction had been replaced by genuine interest in his own thoughts, feelings, and ongoing development. But he also recognized that complete isolation was neither healthy nor sustainable. The challenge was finding ways to contribute meaningfully to human community without compromising the principles and practices that had enabled his transformation. Lorenzo began teaching occasional seminars on personal development, sharing the insights and methods that had guided his own growth. This provided an outlet for his knowledge while connecting him with others who were serious about their own development. Teaching forced him to articulate clearly what he had learned and helped him continue refining his understanding. He also began mentoring younger professionals in his industry, offering guidance that combined practical business advice with deeper principles about character development and effective decision-making. These relationships provided him with a sense of purpose while creating connections based on mutual growth rather than mutual need. Most importantly, he learned to view his isolation not as a problem to be solved but as a natural consequence of choosing an uncommon path. The loneliness of strength was the price of refusing to remain small for others' comfort, but it was a price that became easier to bear as the benefits of discipline continued to compound. The man who destroys his weak self must accept that he will become incomprehensible to those who remain identified with their limitations. This is not a failure of communication or compassion but an inevitable result of psychological evolution. Just as a butterfly cannot return to the caterpillar stage, the person who has genuinely transcended their former limitations cannot pretend to still be governed by the fears and needs that once defined them. But this evolution, while sometimes lonely, is ultimately an act of service to the human community. Every person who chooses growth over comfort, discipline over impulse, and strength over weakness demonstrates that these choices are possible. Their example may make others uncomfortable, but it also proves that the limitations most people accept as permanent are actually choices that can be changed through sustained effort and wise guidance. Lorenzo's journey from weakness to strength was complete not when he eliminated all difficulties from his life, but when he developed the capacity to handle any difficulty with grace, wisdom, and effectiveness. The isolation that accompanied this development was not a punishment but a natural consequence of operating from a different level of consciousness than most of his contemporaries. As he stood in his study that December evening, looking out at the lights of Florence below, Lorenzo felt not loneliness but a deep satisfaction with the choices that had brought him to this point. The weak self that others missed was gone forever, replaced by something far more valuable, a human being capable of living intentionally, loving wisely, and contributing meaningfully to the world without sacrificing his essential integrity. The discomfort his strength caused others was simply confirmation that he had indeed transcended the unconscious agreements that keep most people small, safe, and ultimately unfulfilled. His discipline had made him indestructible not because he could avoid all pain, but because he could transform any experience into wisdom, any setback into strength, and any challenge into an opportunity for deeper understanding. This was the final lesson of Machiavellian self-mastery, the recognition that true power comes not from the ability to control others or circumstances, but from the development of a consciousness that cannot be diminished by external forces. The man who destroys his weak self becomes truly indestructible because destruction can only occur through the cooperation of weakness, and that cooperation is no longer available to be given.